There is something about silence that people don't trust, especially when it comes to someone like Angelina Jolie, because in a world where everyone explains everything, she doesn't. Not fully, not clearly, and definitely not in the way people expect, which creates a problem, because when people don't get answers, they don't stop asking. They don't move on. They don't let it go. They start filling in the gaps with assumptions, with interpretations, with stories that feel real, simply because nothing is there to replace them. And over time, those stories begin to take shape. They repeat. They spread. They settle into something that feels like truth, even when they were never confirmed. And that is where her silence becomes powerful. Not because it says something, but because it allows everything else to be said for her. Every headline, every opinion, every theory, all moving in different directions, without ever reaching a final answer. And that lack of closure does something unexpected. It keeps the story alive. Because when something is fully explained, it ends. But when it isn't, people stay. They keep watching. They keep questioning. They keep trying to understand something that never fully reveals itself. And that is the part most people miss. Her silence isn't empty. It's active. It shapes perception, without ever needing to define it. Most people believe that explaining yourself is a form of control. That if you clarify your story, you protect your image, you correct misunderstandings, you guide how people see you. And on the surface, that sounds true. Because explanation creates structure. It gives people something clear to follow, something stable to hold on to. But that only works when people are willing to accept what you say, and that is the part most don't realize. Because once your image becomes global, explanations stop being solutions. They become negotiations. Every word gets analyzed. Every sentence gets taken apart. Every pause starts to mean something. And suddenly, you are no longer telling your story. You are defending it, reacting to interpretations that you didn't create and can't fully control. Because each explanation doesn't close the gap. It multiplies it. It creates new angles, new questions, new doubts. And over time, the more you try to explain, the more you feed the system that is trying to define you, until one day, you realize something uncomfortable. You are no longer in control of your image. You are participating in a conversation that will never fully end, because every answer becomes another starting point, another version of the story, another layer that moves further away from who you actually are. And that is when explanation stops being strength and quietly becomes a form of weakness. At some point, whether consciously or not, that pattern begins to change, because continuing to explain means continuing to play a game you can't fully control, a game where the rules keep shifting, where the audience decides what matters, and where every response only resets the cycle. And that is where her approach becomes different. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, through smaller choices. Moments where she says less instead of more. Moments where she steps back instead of stepping in. And over time, those choices begin to form a pattern people don't immediately recognize. Because it doesn't look like control, it looks like absence, like something is missing, something that should be there, but isn't. And that creates tension, because people expect resolution. They expect clarity. They expect a complete version of the story. But instead, they get fragments, silence, gaps that never fully close. And that is where the shift happens. Because by refusing to complete the story, she changes how the story exists. It stops being something she explains and becomes something people try to figure out. And that difference is everything. Because when you are explaining, you are inside the narrative. But when you step back, the narrative begins to move around you, shaped by perception, driven by curiosity, and sustained by the absence of certainty. And in that space, something unexpected happens. The need for answers becomes stronger than the answers themselves. And that is when saying less starts to mean more. There is a shift that happens, when someone stops trying to control perception directly. It is not obvious. It doesn't announce itself, but it changes everything. Because instead of giving people something fixed to hold on to, they give them uncertainty. And uncertainty is where attention lives. Because the human mind doesn't stay with what is resolved. It moves on. It forgets. But what remains unclear, what feels incomplete, stays active. It keeps returning. It keeps asking for meaning. And that is what her silence creates. Not clarity, but a constant sense of something unfinished, something just out of reach. And that feeling keeps people engaged far longer than answers ever could. Because when something is defined, it becomes limited. It can be agreed with or rejected. But when it isn't, it expands, it adapts, it becomes different things to different people. And that makes it harder to challenge, harder to break, harder to replace, because there is nothing fixed to push against. And that is where the power shifts, away from explanation and into perception, away from what is said and into what is felt. Because now, the audience is no longer receiving a message. They are participating in it, projecting their own interpretations, filling in the gaps with their own beliefs, and in that process, they become more invested, more certain about something that was never confirmed, and that creates a paradox. The less that is explained, the more real it begins to feel. And that is the point where silence stops being absence and becomes influence. People say they want answers, clarity, resolution, something they can understand and move on from. But what actually keeps them engaged is something else entirely. It's uncertainty, because certainty ends curiosity. It closes the loop. It tells the mind, there is nothing left to find, nothing left to question, nothing left to return to. And once that happens, attention fades, quietly, naturally, almost without being noticed. But uncertainty does the opposite. It keeps the loop open. It creates tension, a sense that something is missing, something unresolved, something that should make sense, but doesn't. And that feeling is difficult to ignore. Because the mind doesn't like unfinished patterns. It wants completion. It searches for meaning. It keeps revisiting the same question from different angles, trying to find something that fits. And that is exactly what her silence maintains. Not confusion, but continuation, a structure that never fully closes, a narrative that never fully settles. And because of that, people don't disengage. They don't move on. They stay connected, even when they think they are done. Because somewhere in the background, the question is still there, unanswered, unresolved, and still pulling them back. Again, and again, and again. Because in the end, her silence isn't avoidance. It's positioning, a deliberate way of existing outside the constant cycle of explanation and reaction. Because once you step into that cycle, you are always responding, always adjusting, always trying to keep up with something that never stops moving. And eventually, you stop defining who you are and start negotiating it. But when you step out of that cycle, something changes. You are no longer giving people something clear to dissect, something to argue with, something to reduce into a single explanation. And without that, the image becomes harder to fix in place, harder to simplify, harder to control, but also harder to break. Because what cannot be fully defined cannot be easily destroyed. It moves, it adapts, it exists in multiple interpretations at once, and that makes it more resilient than anything that is clearly explained. Because clarity creates edges, and edges can be attacked. But ambiguity doesn't. It dissolves those edges. It removes the points of impact and leaves something else behind, something less certain, but far more durable. And maybe that is the real reason. She never explains anything, not because she has nothing to say, but because saying less protects something deeper than words ever could. It protects the space where perception is still forming, still shifting, still open, and in that space, control doesn't look like control. It looks like silence, and that silence is where her power lives, because in the end, The people who explain everything eventually run out of explanations. But the ones who don't are never fully finished, never fully defined, and therefore never fully understood. And sometimes that is the strongest position of all.